in retribution attacks on Afghanistan. Taliban leadership late last night issuing further statements. Spokesman Abdul Hai Mutmain from the spiritual leadership base in Kandahar in southern Afghanistan, appealing to the United States, saying that Afghans were poor, saying that any attacks on the country would not help Afghans and Afghanistan, saying that the cost of any single missile was greater than the cost of any single building in Afghanistan. Also saying that killing the Taliban leadership was not a worthwhile thing. And again, distancing Osama bin Laden from the center of international suspicion for these attacks, saying that Osama bin Laden himself could not have been responsible. So clearly apprehension within the leadership of the Taliban. Very significantly here in Kabul as well, the population and the Taliban leadership concerned that any attacks on Kabul could help open the doorway to the Northern Alliance. That is the group that the Taliban have been fighting against to gain control of the country. The Northern Alliance controls about 5% of the territory in the northeast part of Afghanistan. There is a front line 30 miles north of the city, Kabul. It's been static for the last 5 years, more or less. There was heavy fighting. We could hear heavy fighting on that front line last night. Taliban jet fighters were taking off, heading in that direction. The fear amongst some of the population here and amongst the Taliban leadership is that should there be a sustained attack on the Kabul area, that could help push forward an advance by their opposition to retake Kabul. These are all concerns right now in the forefront of the minds, not only of the people here, but also the leadership. Lolita.
Nick, thank you.
Pakistan is the main supporter of the Taliban. And while Osama bin Laden has not officially been termed a suspect in the attacks, Washington is expecting help from Pakistan in the investigation.
We have not made a determination yet as to who is responsible for yesterday's attack. But we thought, as we gather information and as we look at possible sources of the attack, it would be useful to point out to the Pakistani leadership at every level that we are looking for and expecting their fullest cooperation and their help and support as we conduct this investigation and as we generate more information.
In a statement issued Thursday, Pakistan pledged full cooperation with the United States.
While the world's attention was focused on the U.S., Israeli tanks and bulldozers rolled into the West Bank for a second straight day. The Israeli military says it attacked several Palestinian outposts in the West Bank in an effort to disrupt terror activity in the area. Witnesses say residents of Jenin exchanged fire with Israeli troops who destroyed a police compound they first attacked Tuesday. Palestinian officials say the attacks were unprovoked and accuse Israel of using the U.S. tragedy to divert attention from their attacks on Palestinians.
Saudi Arabia joined several other Arab states in expressing sympathy for the U.S. This as investigators disclosed that at least 2 of the men suspected in the attacks were Saudi nationals.
If this case is proven beyond doubt that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Arab people, the Muslim people will help to expose the identities of the perpetrators of this crime. Lately, the media mentioned Osama bin Laden as a Saudi citizen. We in the kingdom, the government and the people of Saudi Arabia refuse to have any person affiliated with terrorism to be connected to our country.
U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft calls the probe into Tuesday's attacks the most massive and intensive investigation in American history. And as David Ensor reports, U.S. officials apparently have already made some significant progress.
U.S. officials say on the passenger manifests of the hijacked planes used in the attacks, they found names associated with terrorist groups. Intelligence officials say the evidence still points to the Al-Qaeda group, headed by Osama bin Laden.
There had to be some brains behind this. We have some good, promising leads. They're obviously being followed.
Publicly, the Bush administration is accusing no one so far, while warning nations they too will pay for any help given to those who attacked New York and Washington.
We will hold accountable those countries that provide support, that give host nation, if you can call it that, support and facilities to these kinds of terrorist groups.
Afghanistan's Taliban government has long offered haven to bin Laden, but U.S. officials say they have no evidence thus far of any state directly assisting the attacks in New York and Washington. Many analysts argue that such a coordinated broadside could not have been possible without it.
Osama bin Laden represents a complete terrorist network. He will have one or more state sponsors, countries that he's either based in or working in collusion with. There'll have been passport support, communication support.
One thing I think that ought to make us a bit suspicious about whether bin Laden was involved in it alone or not is that he goes to great lengths to advertise himself. And when you see something like that, you begin to wonder whether or not there may be an effort to draw our attention solely to him, to the neglect of someone who may be his principal contractor.
If there was state support, a number of terrorism experts point to Iraq as the most likely suspect. A statement from President Saddam Hussein on Iraqi television said, quote, "The United States reaps the thorns that its rulers have sown in the world."
U.S. officials say they are developing good law enforcement and intelligence leads. They do not know yet who was behind these attacks, nor whether any state assisted them. But they believe they soon will. David Ensor, CNN, Washington.
Experts say the magnitude of Tuesday's attack suggests that the action was organized by a highly sophisticated group or groups of terrorists intent on generating chaos and fear, as much damage and loss of life as possible. And it represents a massive breach of U.S. national security. Joining us from our London studios, Paul Slaughter, Chief Executive Officer of the international security firm TASC International. Mr. Slaughter, thank you very much for joining us. What do you think?
Pleasure.
What do you think of the security measures that we're hearing now that the FAA is planning to introduce at U.S. airports?
I think it's probably long awaited. The big problem with security matters is that anyone who wants to perpetrate these type of crimes, they've always got the advantage of time. And they know when they're going to do it, where they're going to do it. All security matters are breachable. You can either go round, over, through, under. You cannot have a complete 100% guaranteed security measures in place. The big problem is that the perpetrators of crimes such as this, as I said, know when they're going to do it. And no security matters can fully protect establishments, airlines, buildings, or anything like that.
So what can protect them better?
Obviously, increased security matters, and you just have to try and make places like that a harder target to attack. With the advent of X-ray machines, perhaps body searching, greater vetting of passengers, but of course this imposes on travel, civil liberties, things like that. It has to be a balancing act. But unfortunately, as has quite often been said, and the IRA have been quoted, they only have to be lucky once. And unfortunately, when they are as lucky as this, you're going to have the body toll that we've seen and will see in future days to come.
Mrs. Slaughter, what about the cockpit, making it very difficult to breach the cockpit door and get inside and hijack a plane?
That's one measure, but of course you have to take into account the human factor. And obviously when the terrorists got on board and probably started attacking the stewardesses or passengers with the knives they had on board, it takes a very determined, logical flight crew not to open the door when they're hearing screaming, pandemonium, panicking within the cabin itself. And for the pilot or co-pilot or engineer not to open the door to try and find out what's happening is a very, very difficult thing to do. I don't believe you can criticize them for trying to find out what's happening behind them. Perhaps we need to have cameras installed on aircraft so the pilot can see what's going on behind him. But of course all these measures take financing, and probably you're going to have maybe acts of government to ensure that these take place.
What do you think was the biggest mistake that was made by U.S. officials in this case?
I think that's very difficult to say. It's the big problem is that you have to balance security measures with civil liberties and also with people traveling all over the world. if you have a complete security package, excuse me, you're not going to have people travelling because they won't want to. Obviously, allowing these people onto the aircraft with whatever weapons they had, and all we've heard is that they had knives. Well, you can do as much damage with a 3-inch blade as you can with a 6-9-inch blade. And it's quite easy to get those on board aircraft. I mean, knives now can be secreted in belt buckles, in pens that work, and all they have to do is to grab hold of a stewardess or a passenger, stab them in the right place, and you're going to have copious quantities of blood all over the place, which instills panic in people.
Mrs. Slaughter, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thousands are feared dead. The United States and its NATO allies are preparing to respond, and families have been torn apart, perhaps irreparably. But beyond the devastating human toll, there could be another impact from all of this, specifically on the global economy and the markets. Richard Quest joins us now from London, where he's been watching business unfold. Richard?
Many thanks, Jonathan. Officials at the European Central Bank will meet in Frankfurt later this Thursday. They'll be deciding what more they can do to limit the global economic impact of the attack on the World Trade Center. There have been calls for European countries to cut interest rates to help stabilise the global economy, to bring an air of stability in this uncertain time. But many analysts do not expect the ECB to cut its short-term interest rates when they do have that meeting. Let's take a look at the latest currency rates that we're seeing around the globe. You'll see now that the US dollar has gained back some strength at 119 Japanese yen against the euro. It's just at 90 US cents to the new single currency. The new European trading day is underway. Let's catch up with how trading is going and what stocks may be of interest. Liz George is at the London Stock Exchange. Liz?
Richard, thanks very much indeed. Notwithstanding the feelings here very much of shock and distress at what happened in New York, there is a feeling of wanting to conduct business as usual and really getting on with trading. Although, of course, volumes are very, very light and trading is extremely muted. Now, we saw a very volatile day on the markets yesterday. I was talking to Jeremy Stretch of the Bank of Canada earlier on, and he was saying people really didn't have any idea where to price things, and that's why we were seeing such huge leaps around in the markets and such enormous volatility. And really today is likely to be very much more of the same. The markets are open, and this is where they've opened at, all of them trading slightly lower today. Towards the end of the day yesterday, we began to recover some of those dramatic losses, but now they're beginning to fall off again. Everyone really now looking towards the US, hoping that the US will open and also give some direction, but of course being very aware that once the US does open for trade on the equity markets, there may be some dramatic reaction there, a big sell-off going on there until things come out, and people saying really it's going to be about 4 weeks before we begin to see any calms return. Let me just show you one or two individual stocks. Of course, it was the consumer cyclicals which saw a very big sell-off. Companies like British Airways. British Airways losing around about $9 million a day from its planes being grounded. It's down 7.21%. The insurers, of course, which have risk over in the US, saw a very big sell-off yesterday. Today, they're beginning to come back a little bit. Allianz, Europe's largest insurer, up 1.65% in the early market. And LVMH, the consumer luxury goods company, also selling off today, worrying about what impact this is going to have on the US consumer. Richard.
Liz George at the London Stock Exchange. Gold and oil have been much in the news. Let's catch up with how those have traded, starting with gold, where the price is now at around $278 an ounce. It's reversed some of the gains that were seen in the initial panic after the attack. Now markets starting to calm down somewhat. And Brent crude at around $28 an ounce. Again, prices starting to come back as people realise that supply will be maintained. Over now to Maggie Lake in New York to bring us up to date with events on financial markets and what we can look forward to there. Maggie?
Richard, of course, the stock markets will not be trading today. That gives us all time to contemplate the events. And, of course, the task of picking up the pieces now lies ahead. Companies are grappling with how they will cope in the wake of the attack. Among the hardest hit will be the airline industry. For the first time in history, all commercial air travel in the United States was suspended Tuesday. Airports were again closed Wednesday, and service will be limited at best later today, which is, of course, Thursday morning. The effect of the disruption is staggering. The airline industry generates generates about $90 to $100 billion in revenues. About 4,000 planes fly a day domestically, while